illegal. This spying program violated the law. We had a law in place after the Church Committee investigated the CIA and the NSA in the mid-70s that said that the government here on out is barred from spying on the calls of any Americans without first going to the FISA court and getting a warrant. That was what the law required. The Bush and Cheney administration, when they implemented the spying program, did not deny that that program was in violation of that law. They admitted it. I mean, it was clear as day. There was no argument about that. What they argued instead was, under Article 2 of the Constitution, the president basically has unlimited power when it comes to national security, even to violate laws enacted by Congress, that national security is the responsibility of the president, and no law, no act of Congress, no judicial ruling can limit what he can do. It was a very radical theory of executive power enacted in the wake of the 9/11 attack. But at least back then, as much as I was opposed to it, they had the excuse that we really did actually just suffer a pretty cataclysmic attack on American soil that killed 3,000 people, that brought down the World Trade Center, that flew a plane into the Pentagon. So there was at least that there was a real war, or a real act of war that was pretty traumatic on the United States. But even then, the reason why I started writing about journalism was because I realized that this scheme of warrantless eavesdropping was a grave threat to everything our republic was supposed to be about, to the privacy rights of American citizens. You can't have the government spying on our calls and reading our emails without warrants. And what the New York Times revealed, and the reason I ended up devoting my first year and a half of journalism almost exclusively to the story and wrote a book on it, was because it was illegal. The president broke the law. Bush and Cheney broke the law by implementing this spying program. But that was 2005. Nobody was willing to raise their voice too much in opposition to anything that was done in the name of stopping terrorism. And so instead of holding Bush and Cheney accountable, impeaching them, or investigating them, or prosecuting them, what the Congress did on a very bipartisan basis was enacted a new law in 2008 that had no purpose other than to retroactively legalize the spying program Bush and Cheney implemented. To say that when the United States government is listening to the calls of people on other soil besides the United States, they're permitted to spy on those calls without warrants, even if the calls involve American citizens. Obviously, it's way more common these days for American citizens to talk to foreign nationals. And what that did was essentially hand the power to the president, not just that president, but every president since, to spy on your calls with no warrant as long as they claimed that their target was the foreign national. And that means that in thousands of cases every year, the US government, the NSA, spies on your calls without first getting warrants, in direct contravention of the Fourth Amendment. At the time, Republicans were fully supportive of the war on terror. They overwhelmingly voted for that law that the Bush administration wanted. But Democrats, the majority of them at least, voted no. A significant minority voted yes, because back then Democrats were very supportive of this war on terror. But at least a majority of Democrats voted no. Almost every civil liberties group warned that this was a major threat to our privacy rights. The ACLU, every other major privacy group, press freedom group, because journalists could be spied on. So there was a real division that Republicans were entirely united in support of this, and while establishment Democrats were also, a lot of Democrats were opposed. There was vibrant Democratic opposition. Mostly Democrats were opposed. And I was vehemently opposed and was writing about it at the time. As I said, I ended up writing my first book on this. Now, one of the things that was done, as often happens, it was done with the Patriot Act, when the government wants to enact a new radical law, is it says, oh, don't worry. Yes, this power seems extreme. It's completely contrary to everything you were taught about how the republic was supposed to function, but it's just temporary. You don't have to worry. It's just temporary. Every 4 years, Congress has to renew it. And the only way this law will continue is if Congress comes and finds the emergency is still continuing, and therefore these powers can't be rescinded yet. So just like the Patriot Act, every 4 years since 2001 has been renewed with almost no opposition, 87-11 in the Senate, those kinds of votes. That's what's happened with this law as well, even though there's basically no war on terror anymore. No one ever talks about Al-Qaeda. There's no more Al-Qaeda or even ISIS. They've been vanquished and defeated. There's been no mass terrorist attacks on American soil in many years, certainly never of the kind which prompted it in the first place, namely 9/11. So even if you're someone who in 2002 thought these kinds of laws were necessary, nobody thinks there's a war on terror of this kind now that justifies a full-scale assault on our civil liberties, especially given how many people now realize that the CIA, the FBI, the NSA cannot be trusted with these powers because they don't use them for their stated purpose, but instead use them to interfere in our domestic politics by spying on people who are their political enemies. And yet, during the Obama years, even though Obama ran on a platform to reverse all these things, he too demanded a renewal of this law. And the renewal, as it turned out, happened to come up right in the wake of our Snowden reporting, when polls showed that people on the right and the left were angry about warrantless spying, were angry about what the NSA was doing. And a bill was introduced in Congress that was extremely bipartisan in the best sense of the word. The co-sponsors were Justin Amash, who at the time was a Tea Party Republican, a libertarian, one of the staunchest opponents of American spying in the Republican Party, and John Conyers, the kind of old school liberal. And both of them were from Michigan. One was black and elderly and liberal, and the other one was young and very conservative, but they were both from Michigan. There was this strong symbolism to this law to basically eliminate this sort of spying in the wake of the Snowden reporting and other kinds of abuses as well that we revealed. And it was clear this bill was going to pass. It was gathering a lot of steam among both Democrats and Republicans, angry about the revelations of the Snowden reporting. And yet that bill ended up at the last second failing by a few votes. And the person who saved it, here you see her name in the headline of this foreign policy article from July 25th, 2013, is Nancy Pelosi. How Nancy Pelosi saved the NSA program. Essentially, Barack Obama called her and said, Nancy, we're going to lose this spying power. Remember, this is now 11 years after 9/11, 12 years after 9/11, 2013. And he's still, Barack Obama, who ran on a platform of doing this, was insisting that we needed more of these spying powers. And so we called Nancy Pelosi and said, you need to do whatever you have to do. Like, give these people committees assignments, promise them pork barrel spending for their district, get enough votes in the Democratic Party to sabotage this bill. And she did. And this bill that looked like it was on its way to passing, the first ever congressional rollback of new state powers claimed after 9/11, ended up instead being sabotaged by the Democratic Party and Nancy Pelosi. Here you see the explanation of what happened. It's a fascinating history, especially since Biden is now demanding a renewal of the same law, now another decade later. Quote, the obituary of Congressman Justin Amash's amendment to claw back the sweeping powers of the NSA has largely been written as a victory for the White House and the NSA chief Keith Alexander, who lobbied the Hill aggressively in the days and hours ahead of Washington's shockingly close vote. But Hill sources say most of the credit for the amendment's defeat goes to someone else, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi. It's an odd turn considering that Pelosi has been on many occasions a vocal surveillance critic. But ahead of the razor-thin 205 to 217 vote, that was the margin by which this extremely sweeping reform bill failed, 205 to 217. She got about 6 more Democrats than she needed to make sure this passed, this failed. the razor-thin vote ahead of it, which would have severely limited the NSA's ability to collect data on Americans' telephone records, Pelosi privately and aggressively lobbied wayward Democrats to torpedo the amendment. A Democratic committee aide with knowledge of the deliberation tells the Cable, quote, Pelosi had meetings and made a plea to vote against the amendment, and that had a much bigger effect on swing Democratic voters against the amendment than anything Keith Alexander had to say, said the source, keeping in mind concerned White House efforts to influence Congress by Alexander and Director of National Intelligence James Clapper. Clapper, too, was agitating for renewal of this law. Quote, had Pelosi not been as forceful as she had been, it's unlikely there would have been more Democrats for the amendment. With 111 liberal to moderate Democrats voting for the amendment, alongside 94 Republicans, as bipartisan as it gets, the vote in no way fell along predictable ideological fault lines. And for a particular breed of Democrat, Pelosi's overture proved decisive, multiple sources said. Pelosi had a big effect on more middle-of-the-road, hawkish Democrats who didn't want to be identified with a bunch of lefties voting for the amendment, said the aide. As for the Alexander briefings, did they hurt? No. But that was not the central force, at least among House Democrats. Nancy Pelosi's political power far outshines that of Keith Alexander's. Now, that is why the U.S. government, to this very day, even in the wake of all that Snowden reporting we did and the public anger over it, that is why that bill continues to exist. 4 years later, it was renewed again, this time in 2018. And what was remarkable about this was by 2018, Donald Trump was president. And it was very common for Democrats to call Trump a new Hitler, to warn that he was attempting to install a new white supremacist dictatorship, that he was an existential threat to the republic, all the things that we still hear and heard back then about Donald Trump from Democrats. And yet, they were able to keep this bill intact, this warrantless spying power fully empowered with no reforms, because the same people who were calling Trump Hitler and a dictator, Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, Eric Swalwell, joined with the Republican establishment to ensure that this bill passed and that efforts to reform it were sabotaged. And there you see on screen the article that I wrote at the time when the vote happened. Quote, the same Democrats who denounced Donald Trump as a lawless, treasonous authoritarian just voted to give him vast spying power, vast warrantless spying power. And then I asked, how can the rhetoric about Trump from Democratic leaders be reconciled with their actions to protect the unchecked power to spy on Americans? So no matter what happens, this is all theater. The Democrats claim that Bush and Cheney are Nazis for wanting to spy on you with no warrants, but then Obama gets into office and with Pelosi saves the bill. Trump is in office and the Democrats claim he's Hitler, and yet hand Hitler the right to spy on Americans with no warrants and prevent any reforms or safeguard or oversight from diluting the bill. So now flash forward 4 more years, and this bill it's time to renew it again. But this time, the chance that it could be renewed is not quite as high as it has been in the past. And that's true for 2 reasons. One, we're now 22 years after the 9/11 attack. I mean, at some point, it's going to become increasingly difficult to continue to claim that all of these powers that everybody at the time admitted were radical and extreme, even the advocates, but who justified them in the name that we face a national security emergency in the name of Al-Qaeda and Muslim extremism. At some point, every year that goes by, when more and more voters don't even remember that, didn't live through it, wake up every day and don't give a single thought to Al-Qaeda, at some point there's going to be questioning of whether or not we really need to allow the government to continue to spy on us. And now we're 22 years later, and I think it's increasingly difficult to maintain the argument that we actually still face some sort of national security emergency of the kind that should allow Joe Biden to spy on the calls and emails of American citizens without warrants. That's one of the reasons why there's difficulty. But the other is that there's no question that the Republican Party has radically transformed on these questions. They have seen with their own eyes in the Trump era how readily and casually and aggressively and destructively the U.S. security state abuses their power, how often it's used not to protect Americans from foreign threats, but to attack Americans for domestic political ends. And there's far greater skepticism about these powers than there ever was before within the Republican Party, which is why a significant wing of the Republican Party, namely the anti-establishment populist wing, is very likely to vote, at least in large number, against the Biden administration's request to renew these powers. The question is whether there will be now enough Democrats who, remember, during the actual war on terror were against this, whether they're now going to suddenly change and say, you know what, I actually like these powers, just like I like the U.S. security state, even though there's no more war on terror. Imagine that, a Democratic Party that was against these powers when there was a war on terror and now is ready to say, I'm in favor of these powers, I like these warrantless spying powers when a Democrat is in office and there's no more war on terror. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.